afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a number of people who are joining us while we're presenting. So I think rather than wait, we will probably start sort of carrying on if that's okay. I'm Jürgen. I'm partner and head of life sciences, pharma and medtech at MHA. We're a top 13 firm of chartered accountants and a member of Baker Tilly International, which is a globally ranked 9th. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the webinar. Our focus today is to provide you with some additional and invaluable insights for AI and regulatory compliance, international dimension, intellectual property, and transfer pricing. Just before we get started, I would like to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and the aim is that we will distribute this in the next couple of days together with our next future event as well. The plan is to basically have 40 minutes or so to discuss on hopefully topical issues that you'll find of interest, and then that will be followed by a Q&A. So please do use the Q&A function so that we can answer some of your questions later on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my fellow panelists. Peter?
Thanks, Jürgen. Yes, my name is Peter Bannister. I'm Managing Director of Romilly Life Sciences. We're a Baker Tilly partner organisation, and our expertise relates to the commercialisation of technology-based products for healthcare and life sciences. This includes evidence generation, but also the practicalities of building products and releasing them into the market, all underpinned by very strong evidence. A particular specialism that we have is around the use of digital health and also artificial intelligence as it relates to healthcare today. Really looking forward to today's discussion.
Good. Maybe Klaus, next to you.
Yes, hello everybody, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here at this webinar. It's a very interesting subject. My name is Klaus Andersen. I'm partner at Freeth. Freeth is a full-service law firm. I head up the life science department at Freeth, where we advise pharma companies, medtech companies, biotech companies, and health tech companies in relation to their needs. That could be M&A activity, it could be investment, employment work, licensing, or real estate. And yes, I look very much forward to this discussion because it's a very hot topic.
Thank you, Klaus. Chris, a couple of words from you, please.
Thanks, Jürgen, and hello everyone. My name is Chris Liu, and I'm a transfer pricing partner at MHA in London. Over the past 16 years, I've been advising clients from the UK, US, Japan, and China in the life science sector on their overseas expansion and cross-border transactions. I also specialize in advising transactions in relation to IP and financing from a transfer pricing perspective. So looking forward to learning from our panelists today, because I think this is a very interesting topic.
Thank you, Chris. Indeed. So maybe Peter, if I could just get the show going and maybe ask you. So can you possibly share some examples of how AI is enhancing the efficiency and accuracy of clinical trials and diagnostics and evidence generations in life sciences, and then the potential impact, obviously, these advancements are having on patient outcomes?
Of course. So it's a hugely dynamic and diverse space in terms of the activity that's going on today, not least because artificial intelligence carries so many meanings for different people. So what I'll try to do to give is an approximate view across sectors as to where some of the most promising developments are being progressed. I think in terms of the way you framed the question, I think where people really hope that artificial intelligence will have the most value across life sciences and healthcare is in terms of allowing us to take advantage of more detailed information that's collected today. For example, collection of genomic data to try and inform personalized treatments, which are difficult to manage manually, that data overload problem. Something that's very motivating for me is the opportunity to take well understood parts of good clinical practice and embed that using artificial intelligence so that parts of the world and parts of the country which currently don't enjoy the same access to high quality healthcare that some of us are lucky enough to do can also receive good quality care in a timely manner and therefore receive positive outcomes. So that model of using artificial intelligence to augment, not replace the clinician, and extend their reach and make them available 24/7 is a very appealing and motivating one. If we look at some specific examples where, again, across quite a broad cross-sectoral definition, we see AI in its various forms being used. If I start maybe with the clinical development, the therapeutic development, clinical research value chain or pathway, we see artificial intelligence being used to improve the reliability of identification of target molecules for drug development, carry out and help de-risk earlier things like toxicology and the whole overall lead discovery and optimization process that is necessary for promising new molecules to be assessed and shortlisted and then taken into clinical studies. It's also being used, maybe we'll come back to this in a bit more detail later today, it's also being used in terms of the actual design, recruitment and execution of clinical studies, where artificial intelligence using technologies, for example, like chatbots, not only can increase the engagement of those who are recruited into these trials and make them feel more in the loop and less likely to drop out of the trials, which, as we all know, carries a huge cost for those charged with delivering clinical studies, but can also provide well-validated novel endpoints that can allow clinical trials to be optimized and steered in flight and potentially provide earlier readouts that are satisfactory or at least helpful to the regulators. When we think about molecules and drugs that have actually gone through the validation process and received market approval, technologies such as artificial intelligence still have a role. For example, in again allowing more precise patient stratification and identification for drugs that are now on the market, and also supporting ongoing engagement with what can be sometimes quite challenging treatment regimes that people who are afforded the second or third line interventions need to go through. Taking a very brief bird's eye view of how this might also play out in diagnostics, this is more of a kind of a thematic application view rather than a end-to-end, because as we all know, medical devices have lots of different roles. But we see artificial intelligence in some cases regulated and market approved forms being used for in vitro diagnostics, in radiology, around wearables, for example, the management of long conditions like long COVID and diabetes. Also in terms of supporting more precise prescribing, in applications such as surgery, artificial intelligence is being used to try and predict the likely post-surgical outcomes of someone, let's say, receiving a hip implant based on knowledge of how previous procedures have gone for similar patients. And when we start to think about mental health, it has great potential to allow mental health interventions, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, to start earlier than the time when people currently actually get the chance to see an in-person psychologist if they're prescribed that course of treatment. So plenty of very tangible advances, a lot of promise and expectation, but as I think we'll probably explore over the course of today's session, in many cases at a fairly early stage that requires a really good understanding of what's possible versus what's aspirational at this stage.
And I'm sure with AI, there must be huge cost savings that will probably arise as well, right?
I think definitely in deployment. I think one of the interesting questions at the moment is actually the cost to build AI, both in terms of the highly skilled machine learning engineers that Google and others have snapped out of the market, but also in terms of the actual hardware. And saying something that can't be ignored is actually that training artificial intelligence models has a huge energy requirement. I think that's something with sustainability becoming a non-negotiable in terms of healthcare procurement. That's an interesting topic to explore on maybe on another session.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Klaus, Peter made reference to regulators. I mean, from your perspective, being a lawyer and regulation of AI, do you see a sort of general set of rules in the UK and the EU, or is that still sort of evolving to an extent?
Well, it is something that regulators in EU and the UK have been considering for quite a long time, because the challenge with AI is I think there's been this notion that AI would take over and create either medicine by itself or create other activities or products by itself. So how do you regulate with that? And in this regard, the EU is a bit of a front runner in, at least for now, in relation to a actual legislation targeted against or not or focused on AI. I should say that just because AI may not necessarily be fully regulated everywhere, it doesn't mean that any activity that involves AI all of a sudden cannot be caught by local legislation. It still applies to the activity. But to go back to the EU, so actually last week the European Parliament passed the AI Act in the EU. And it's obviously a quite significant act, and there are one or two things that are quite significant. First of all, it's an act that targets or includes any kind of AI. So it's not necessarily focused on a sector. So there isn't a so to speak, it's not an AI act that only applies to life sciences or pharma companies. It applies to anyone adopting, deploying, promoting AI systems in the EU. And the main aim of the act is to protect the public against tools in AI which could distort their behavior, which could take advantage, an unfair advantage of people's I was about to say handicaps, but people's perhaps vulnerabilities in certain areas. So that's something to keep out for. There are actually quite significant fines attached to or to the act. Any violation could potentially be the higher of 7% of the company's global turnover, or 35 million euros. So it's a bit of the same system as you've got in the GDPR system that that was introduced in 6 years ago, almost. If we then look at the UK, again, as I said, just because something doesn't have a label called an AI Act does not mean that you can just apply AI, and if something goes wrong, you can say, well, I'm sorry, there's no act that involves AI, so I go scot-free. So for instance, if you look at data protection, if you apply AI in your treatment of data protection, you still have to comply with the GDPR. But in terms of a general AI Act, we don't have that yet in the UK. There have been certain initiatives targeted at certain industry, like the automobile sector and other sectors. And I think it to me, the way things look right now, I think the most likely is that if we are going to see specific AI legislation, that will be targeted towards various sectors. I mean, there have been statements for various committees for the House of Lords, for instance, where there's been a sort of resistance towards a general AI Act. So we see there a beginning divergence between the EU approach and the UK approach. The reason why the EU is relevant, so to speak, in spite of Brexit for UK business, is that obviously insofar as they are active in the EU, they will obviously have to observe the EU AI Act.
It's interesting. You know, we talk about the UK and Europe in terms of these regulations. And you know, we also tend to think, Peter, that the AI technologies tend to originate from Europe and the US, but I'm sure globally there must be other regions as well that these technologies are being developed, like China and India, etc. So it'd be interesting to have your views on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just quickly coming back to, I love the fact that Klaus brought up the timeliness of the AI Act, and also the fact that, you know, the UK currently is in a situation where it doesn't necessarily follow that, and it's going to be interesting, to say the least, to see how that plays out. I think over a relatively short number of months, you know, for the benefit to manufacturers is that in the healthcare space specifically, for some time now, there's been a lot of technology that's based around artificial intelligence that's really skirted around the edge and argued the toss about whether it's a medical device or not, and within the letter of the law got away with not being regulated as a medical device. So I think certainly for those of people in Europe, it's going to be a real benefit for patient safety and clinician confidence that these technologies, you know, the ones that are permissible, are going to really be under a more rigorous oversight. And I think actually, although there's a bit of harmonization that needs to be done for manufacturers, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference to people who are already building medical devices in the way that it's intended. So to follow up your question, Jürgen, then yes, it is very tempting to think more locally about where AI innovation comes from, but actually a fairly recent ranking of the top 10 AI countries, not altogether surprisingly, actually placed the United States at the top of the list on the basis that 60% of what's known as top-tier researchers are based within either US universities or in industrial research organizations. But very quickly, we moved to China as second on the list. There's a significant amount of investment by the Chinese government and 95 billion in private investment. And actually looking ahead a couple of years to 27, expected 38.1 billion of investment overall. That's 9% of the world's total. Hopefully there's not too much bias in there. The list I'm looking at, the UK at third, and there definitely is a lot of activity, and we've got a lot of very strong global exemplars like Google DeepMind based in the UK. Then you've got Israel, who've always had a very, very strong profile as a technology innovation nation. Canada, home of Geoffrey Hinton, one of the three godfathers of AI. Number 6, France, which are the home of Yann LeCun, another one of the three godfathers of AI, as they're known within the industry, who's actually been for some time Facebook Meta's head of artificial intelligence. And then you've got India, who have a huge cohort of highly skilled machine learning researchers, and a real early edge in terms of how actually artificial intelligence is being applied in terms of helping support very large and diverse populations. Then you've got Japan, Germany, and currently Singapore rounding out the list. So it's a pretty cosmopolitan picture with relative strengths and weaknesses. And I think there's a lot of alliances being formed at the moment in terms of both regulation, but also technical and commercial capability to try and be the best at doing AI in the most proper way.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned China and India, and I guess the thing with both those countries is you've got the talent pool. I guess you've got the population, and all those things actually have quite an impact. And I guess, Chris, having made some, just come back from recent trips to the Far East, in your view, I mean, what are the unique opportunities and challenges that the adoption of AI present for life science companies operating in, China, Far East, India, and considering factors such as the regulatory frameworks as well, with cultural differences and market dynamics?
Thanks, Jürgen. And I'm not surprised to hear from Peter that China is now ranked number 2 in the top 10 AI countries. There's definitely a huge opportunity in China because, as we all know, like China is a latecomer in this area, only started applying AI in, for example, drug discovery in the past 10 years, but it is now one of the largest or fastest growing markets. Large Chinese IT groups like Tencent, Baidu, and ByteDance, they have also been turning their AI capacity to drug design. There are a very ambitious national strategy aimed at the AI dominance and a massive talent pool of AI researchers, as you mentioned, Jürgen. And then there's also a large number of CROs with which to partner with, and involving health data privacy protection as well. So I think that all of these factors create a very good environment for AI players to grow in this market, in order to make more drugs faster and cheaper, actually. So the China's large population and massive hospitals make it easier to aggregate large data sets as well, because like Peter mentioned at the beginning, like AI plays a very important role when there is an overflow of data to healthcare treatment. And I think this is a very critical requirement for training AI. And there's also less concern about the privacy in China, meaning that the data are easier to access. However, I think the challenge in the meantime is that many of the data are actually of poor quality, which can mislead the AI. And in addition, the difference in the data protection laws can mean that it will create a gap between the Chinese process and the Western process, and create challenges for life science groups to invest into China. And I'm sure it's the same in India as well. So I'm also sure that Klaus will be able to talk about the data protection laws in these areas. So over to you, Jürgen.
I agree. I think in India, we have similar concerns to potentially China as well in terms of security and data protection, etc. And Klaus, I'm sure you probably have had some horror stories of experiences of this particular area. So from your perspective, in terms of companies navigating the complexity of data privacy and security in these sort of jurisdictions, I mean, how does all this work, do you think? And how do we harness all the AI?
Well, I think what one would normally do, like any business that are active in a certain market, is you need to identify how, in this situation, how personal data is protected in for instance, in China and in India, where the issues with data protection normally arises is with the collection, the sharing of data and the general processing and storing of data, and to which extent it is at all possible to monetize the personal data. And the issue we have got sort of coming from a UK and part EU part of it. The reason why I'm mentioning that is because the UK is still, despite Brexit, very much aligned with the EU in practical terms on the treatment of data protection. So insofar as data is collected in this region, I mean, there could be particular challenges in actually using that data in China and India. So you basically need to make sure that your AI tools allows for the difference in the treatment of data protection. Also, if you are active in those markets, you need to be very mindful about the local legislation, because they tend to have legislation which can be quite harsh if you contravene the regulations which are there. So it is very much an exercise about identifying what market are you dealing in, and how do you need to set up your system. And also, I would say that's also a legal part, but there's also a technical part that one shouldn't ignore as well, because there will be technical requirements as well in both jurisdictions that companies need to comply with.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, this data protection, etc., is quite an important part, but I guess there's the practical aspects as well. And I mean, Peter, I mean, how can AI be used to support the delivery of clinical trials? And if so, how does the regulator treat the situation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good place to sort of start to focus in on, compared to the more sort of helicopter view I gave earlier about life sciences in general. So there are some really clearly defined opportunities for artificial intelligence throughout the design, recruitment, and execution of clinical trials. So there are several examples already today of artificial intelligence being used to learn from previous clinical trial protocols and help the development of more optimal protocols for new studies going forwards. Noting some of the challenges of working with inherently messy real-world patient data, artificial intelligence is also being applied to try and select patients for recruitment into clinical trials, both based on the individual patient characteristics, i.e. a better match to the study design than traditional desk-based approaches might have offered, but also in terms of matching to clinical centres which have a better track record of patient engagement and reporting and other things that are really important to clinical research organisations charged with these studies. There's a growing use of what we call digital twins, whereby rather than as you would traditionally do when you start a clinical trial, typically you would, if it was a randomized control trial, quite often you would have a control arm of patients who are not receiving your new treatment versus an interventional arm of patients who are. Digital twin approaches are being applied to create what are known as synthetic or virtual arms. So rather than having to recruit the normal number of patients, you only have to recruit half as many, i.e. the ones that are going to receive the intervention. And then by looking back through historical data, you can use artificial intelligence to retrospectively construct the control arm or virtual arm from this existing data that's on system. And there are early signs and evidence that regulators like the FDA are willing to accept virtual arms, at least as part of the data package that drug developers are submitting, for example, as part of statistical powering or safety studies, for example. Once you actually have patients in a clinical trial, I'm sure many people on this call are aware that, notwithstanding the significant cost of recruiting someone into a clinical trial, commonly held wisdom says that it costs 3 times as much to replace someone if they were to drop out. So tools like chatbots, again, are being used to keep patients engaged. And at a behavioral level, what keeps people engaged is being kept up to date and getting feedback on how the data that they're contributing as a participant in the trial is at least incrementally leading to the delivery of the trial itself. And there's a really interesting space around how artificial intelligence is being used to dive into very dense data sets, medical images, but also genomic data, and start to develop what we call biomarkers. So indicators, phenotypic indicators that a patient is responding or not responding, that are not the ones that a clinician would traditionally observe by looking at the patient data or a patient medical image. And there's, as recently as January, there was an example where the FDA highlighted the use of a technology that was based on artificial intelligence that actually looks at pictures of people's faces and performs a preliminary mental health diagnosis. And the FDA recognized this as part of one of their programs, in this case, one that's known as the Innovative Science and Technology Approaches for New Drugs. So there's a bit of a mouthful, it's called iStand. And it's a number of pilot programs that the FDA and other regulators are putting in place to try and not necessarily rubber stamp these approaches, but start to provide a pathway where they become part of the more established portfolio of tools that developers have. I just wanted to quickly put this in context. So we've heard mention from Chris and others of the use of artificial intelligence in the earlier stages of drug discovery, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about this, and in many cases quite rightly. But Boston Consulting conducted a report late last year, and from publicly available information, they identified only 15 candidate molecules that had been uncovered or discovered through artificial intelligence that had actually at that point in December last year progressed through clinical studies of some form. And that's in the context that last year there were over 22,000 drug compounds in some sort of clinical evaluation. So as I said at the beginning, the hope is that AI can de-risk, manage the uncertainty that's always present at the beginning of these long, difficult clinical development pathways, and mean that maybe those 15 are much more likely to lead to a drug that hits the market. But again, we're in early days. So I think, the data out there suggests there's cause to be cautiously optimistic. But I think all of this needs to be set into the context of it's an early contributor into what is a very busy and difficult space.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's interesting because we talk about technology and etc. And Klaus, I mean, IP obviously is quite an important part of this, right, in terms of ownership and etc. What have you found from your experiences with AI and IP, and how do you actually sort of decipher, and how do you manage and I guess Peter was mentioning about de-risking. How do you actually do that?
Well, the slight challenge we've got at the moment with AI and IP is that much of the IP legislation, regardless of whether it's trademarks or copyright or patent, is basically drafted in a period where you had a human that created it. That is not to say that companies can't own IP. Of course they can, but in effect, it was drafted with that view. There are some statements, for instance, in the Copyright Act that acknowledge electronically generated work. But the slight challenge is that we've got a piece of legislation that assumes that it's a human being that generates it, and that can have in some aspects a slight challenge when you decide who owns it and who's the author or inventor of this. The Intellectual Property Office has taken the view that or as set out in their forms, that an inventor cannot be an AI tool in itself, but usually AI is used as a tool amongst many other things. There will be a human of some sort involved in the process, and I think for now that is probably how. It's obviously a very long and difficult subject, but for now I think that's how we're sort of grappling with that. The other aspect of AI, and just coming back to the good use, as similar to what we see in drug discovery, is that you can use AI to manage your IP in many other aspects. So it could be portfolio management. You check out your which IP you've got that is particular beneficial, and which IP in general in the market is particularly beneficial. But also when you create IP, that you can do a better search in the market and find out whether there are other similar brands, inventions out there, so you don't necessarily infringe them. I think that's another, beneficial. I'm generally quite optimistic about AI. I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing, but I think that's another positive impact where AI will assist in the intellectual property area.
Yeah, no, thank you, Klaus. And we all know that IP carries value. we all know from a tax planning point of view, we'll try and sort of place the IP in its jurisdictions as tax favorable, because all governments worldwide are trying to maximize their own tax take. Chris, from your perspective, doing a lot of sort of planning on the transfer pricing and etc. How would tax authorities view the contribution to the IP rights from AI, and what sort of planning and defense strategy should businesses be thinking of?
Thanks, Jürgen. I think, well, this is a very good question, and I have to take a step back here to introduce some background knowledge, because there have been a lot of changes in the transfer pricing world in the past 10 years. And the OECD initiated an international tax review project in 2013, which is known as the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Project, what we call BEPS. There were 15 action plans coming out of the project, and action 8 to 10 of these plans were to align the transfer pricing outcomes with the value creation from the IP transactions, and this is widely used in IP valuation nowadays from a tax perspective. And as Klaus mentioned, it's the human element that drives the development of the IP. And in the old days, I think we all know that a centralized IP model can mean that companies just set up a legal IP holding company in an offshore location, and then they can shift profits into those jurisdictions without having any substance there. But this type of structure is no longer viable because of the introduction of the BEPS actions. And almost all the OECD countries, they have already legislate these BEPS plans into their legislation, like UK. So nowadays, tax authorities rely on the concept of economic ownership to determine which entity or entities in the group should be entitled to the super profits arising from the IP. So the economic ownership is reflected in 5 key functions, what we call DEMP, which are development, enhancement, maintenance, protection, and exploitation in relation to the IP. So this is what we call the human element, right? So this is usually where the development team are based and the lawyers are based to protect such IP, and we will have to look at the people and function to determine who is actually the economic owner in an IP holding structure. And the legal owner nowadays, as the IP holder, simply contributes to the financing of the activity, would only be entitled to a risk-free return based on its contribution. So going back to Jürgen's question, how would tax authority view the contribution of the IP rights from AI? I think there could be 2 views. So the first view is that the economic ownership of the IP rights will follow the economic ownership of the AI itself, because most of the time the AI, or as Klaus mentioned earlier, like as a tool or as a tech, it could be viewed as an IP itself. So the defense team or even the equipment or the hardware location would determine the economic ownership of the AI, and then the IP rights would follow. So that's the first view. And then the second view is that the economic ownership of the IP should be with the entity where the equipment and hardware and management teams are located. So because these are the critical entities, and even for the energy consumption, as Peter mentioned earlier, it's all related to the AI activities. So this would be the typical views we would expect from tax authorities, but we are now still in early days. We haven't seen any disputes between the taxpayers and tax authorities on this area. However, we have seen recent years tax authority all over the world have been trying to push more towards the profit split method when it comes to IP related transactions, especially there are more than 1 entities in the group who have been contributing to the IP development, and there are uncertainties around the economic ownership. So I would definitely suggest planning ahead and documenting the evidence as early as possible, because this could help your defense against potential tax audits in the future a lot.
Sure. No, thank you, Chris. I'm hoping to carry on with this conversation for another few more minutes, but please feel free to put questions into the Q&A function. So hopefully some of the comments that the panelists have been making you're finding interesting, and is sort of throwing some ideas that you might want some answers to. Peter, maybe if I can jump onto you now in terms of, I mean, how can we ensure that AI helps manufacturers bring solutions to market that can serve the needs of the diverse global population they have? I mean, it was just in the news yesterday about Sudan and all those sort of things, you know, so slightly different, but interesting to know.
No, I think it's all linked, because again, AI is a form of technology that we're trying to use to solve these big challenges. And as I prefaced earlier at the beginning of our talk today, it's a topic where I think it has the greatest potential. Now, the idea being that if we can raise the floor in terms of healthcare by taking known existing medical expertise and making it more accessible, more available in a reliable, regulated, trustworthy way, then hopefully we can start to provide better quality health access to those who lack it today. The challenge, I think, is really that we need to be aware of is that artificial intelligence is, again, as we've already touched on, it's inherently based on data. And if we are to learn, if we're looking to learn how we do healthcare today so that an artificial intelligence tool can play that out in more settings tomorrow, we have to realize that healthcare today is very unfair and biased. There's a lack of equity, there's a lack of equality within the provision of healthcare, and equity in terms of the outcomes that people receive, regardless of their starting point. And I think there's a growing awareness within the industry that there's a real, as there is with other technologies, there's a real danger for silently perpetuating bias when you learn from historical data that itself represents bias. And there's work that's being done now and going forwards that says that it's one thing to acknowledge that the data you train on needs to be diverse and representative, but the next step as a manufacturer that you have to take proactively is to acknowledge the differences in representation and outcomes and equity across that diverse data set, and take active steps as an engineer, as a developer, to mitigate those inequalities, rather than just letting the data play on, in which case those same inequalities are going to be repeated, they're going to be amplified if we apply them in more locations than before. So that getting a handle on the inequalities, and there are frameworks being developed now, for example, the University of Birmingham, who I work with, the Standing Together framework, that get people to think not just who is in the data we're learning from, but how are they represented and what do we need to do to close those inequality gaps, rather than just hope that it happens by osmosis. I think, again, another really timely output that was in the press a week or two ago was that the UK government commissioned a report called Equity in Medical Devices, an independent review. And the reason they did that was because they discovered retrospectively that very simple devices, pulse oximeters, that rely on a form of optical sensing that were used quite widely during COVID, were subsequently found to perform very inadequately on people who didn't have white skin. And so that's not even talking about AI. But what the report did was it then said, well, let's try and look into the future or the present a little bit more. So it looked at those kind of optical devices. It also looked at dangers for perpetuating bias in artificial intelligence, and also looked at that very interesting topic, which is slightly different, around the use of genomic data, where the biases will not be visually apparent, but they will still be, the inequalities will still be there if we don't acknowledge them. And it came out with some very clear recommendations, and just snapshotting a few. And then it goes back to what we should be doing with all development. It talks about co-design throughout development. So at the beginning of trying to solve a problem, taking the time to really understand who the potential beneficiaries are, not making assumptions based on our own narrow experience about how people might interact with the technology, what benefits they might accept, and what environments they might be in. They may not have access to routine medical imaging, for example. So developing an algorithm that's able to detect lung cancer from medical images may just not reach people. There also needs to be training amongst technology professionals in how to identify and mitigate bias. And this is very similar to those of us as professionals who've undergone EDI training and have started to understand micro behaviors and all of these hidden biases that we all need to keep working on. It's not a once and done effort. There needs to be, echoing what Chris and Klaus have said, there needs to be transparency about the data being used and how it currently represents people, and how differs from how we want to serve them in the future. And there's also a recognition that largely clinical and regulatory standards are up to the job at the moment, but there also need to be a subset of them that moves forwards with the capabilities of technology. Going back to Klaus's comments about the AI Act, so we don't end up in a situation where almost unconsciously the technology has leapt ahead and started to do things we're not even aware of, and put us in a position which is very difficult to claw back from, in terms of silent biases and decisions being made on our behalf that are not necessarily the correct ones. And where this also then, it's not all about the manufacturer. Inequality comes not just because the technology doesn't exist, it's because we can't access the technology. So it really calls for not just the industry, but the sectors at large, providers, to make sure that interoperability is is improved. Access is improved. This will require government intervention as well as those of industry, and also, really to make sure that we have minimum standards for procurement, and research is also measured in terms of its success according to how well it can tackle inequality. So a multifaceted problem, one that we should be eager to get into, and some clear guidance out there today as to how manufacturers can proactively steer their technology to help solve this problem, not unconsciously and unwillingly let it perpetuate what already exists today.
Yeah, I mean, Peter, you talk about global populations, and obviously we talk about global solutions, and Chris, obviously transfer pricing must be a key part, as with multinational life science companies, where you are setting up in different jurisdictions and etc. So, what are businesses thinking in terms of valuations of intangible assets and intergroup transactions? Going back to, again, from a tax authority's perspective, that this is an area that obviously is very much of interest to them. Maybe if you could just answer that briefly, because we'll probably then try and go to some questions as well.
Sure. So I think at the end of the day, it's all based on the risk we're dealing with, right? So if we carry out a risk assessment before even making investment into the AI, and plan ahead, determining a step plan for making the investment, then I think that's definitely would be helpful. And the other area that requires more detailed consideration is definitely the financing, because as investing in AI usually means a large amount of upfront investment, like Peter mentioned earlier, the cost to build the AI, the hardware, and the energy consumption. I think those would need the funding to come in quite early on, and whether the investment should be funded with debt or equity is worth planning ahead, and because the interest deduction could also improve tax efficiency in certain jurisdictions, but in the meantime increase the tax compliance burden. So, and we have also seen more and more tax audits and litigation on pricing of shareholder loans in various jurisdictions, including the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, in the past few years. So that would be the other area I would definitely look at, like, before making into the investment.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Chris. Look, it's been really interesting listening to all your views and the impact that AI is actually having in this life science sector. And I'm sure we could carry on having this discussion for quite a much longer time, but time's slightly against us. So what I'd probably like to do is maybe pick up one or two questions that are coming through the Q&A function. But please, audience, do feel free to add some more as well. There's a question, Peter, for you. AI regulation seems to be very emerging field. How can manufacturers be confident that short-term investment in AI will meet future market approvals?
A great question. I think something that I've learned from luckily being exposed to others far wiser than me, working in very diverse engineering disciplines and technologies over the years, is that when something new comes along, the real experience shows that on closer inspection, most of it probably has been seen before, and therefore it exists a pool of knowledge about how to manage it. The challenge is to identify what bit of it is genuinely new and how to manage that. And I think to that point, fundamentally, the regulations that exist governing the development of, let's say, medical devices, and indeed software as a medical device, are compatible with and do encompass the needs of artificial intelligence. I think where there is a need for, and indeed efforts to address additional regulation, is specifically for artificial intelligence, the potential that it has once developed to then go on and learn and ideally improve once it's been exposed to larger and larger, more diverse data sets when it goes out into the field post initial market access. And to that end, last year, the FDA in America, in collaboration with Health Canada and the MHRA in the UK, issued a very clear and actionable set of guidelines called change control plans for software as a medical device. The idea being that if you know upfront that you'd like your technology to have the option to improve and learn more as it goes out into the market, you can do that, but you need to put in place very clear guardrails around how that can be allowed to happen. So I think I would say that the mindset going in is very tempting to get pulled into one of two camps. Either everything's fine, or this is so new that the regulations aren't fit for purpose. But I think the answer inevitably is a bit more nuanced than that. And manufacturers who take the time to understand how much of this is new will not only find out that the challenge is much less daunting and the regulation aspects, but also we'll find that there's probably a very large existing body of expertise, either in healthcare or in other sectors, that they can draw on to accelerate the development to market.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. There's a question from David, which I think all three of you probably can answer on this. It says, what should companies and businesses consider before employing AI tools in their business? Because I'm sure there's a legal aspect, there's a tax aspect, and there's obviously the practical aspect from Peter. So maybe Klaus, you might want to just start off from your legal hat on, and then maybe Chris a bit on the tax side, and maybe Peter then your views on that.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that what you need to consider is obviously sort of, well, that's broader market based. I mean, what do you actually want to use it for? But once you got through the commercial aspect of it, I think what you need to make sure is that whatever you create with using the AI tool, that will actually end up, so to speak, with you as an owner, and that is to you need to look into that there is the correct clauses in the contract. So what you create with the tool is your property. I think that's the main aspect. And then obviously if you go further down the line and you submit applications to the MHRA or similar, you obviously need to treat AI as a useful tool that can help you. But eventually you will have to sign off on the application, and you will have to sort of vouch for the data and the material. That's probably something that Peter knows much more about than I do.
I think all I add to that is going back to something that Chris said, is that most of the time the data, and not just in China that we have to start with, is very, very messy. It's very unstructured. It's poorly labeled. There's a task that's commonly known as curation, whereby raw data sets, whether they're electronic patient records or from other sources, need to be poured over by people who understand their context, i.e. by domain experts, doctors, pharmaceutical experts, to tidy them up quite honestly and put them into a form where they can then be used to train algorithms such as machine learning, artificial intelligence. So I think a lot of the ownership, both the responsibility but also the intellectual ownership, comes in that step of curation. And I think people are hopefully starting to understand that, let's say, a hospital who has a relatively unstructured set of data does not immediately lay claim to all of the effort needed to translate that into a new solution. Similarly, a manufacturer clearly without access to that raw data would not be able to even start thinking about it. So there's got to be, and I believe there is more kind of understanding of the collaborative nature of this work, but as Klaus said, with at some point very clear demarcation of where the intellectual property arises from, and from a liability perspective, particularly as we start to move to more automation, where that lies as well, which is a very interesting, but again, quite broad topic in its own right.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, I'm sure tax is always a consideration, right? That one should think of, although you should make the commercial decision. But do you have briefly some comments to make to David?
Yeah, sure. I think, like I mentioned before, financing, like how to finance the investment is one question to start thinking about, and the other one is the need for where the development team is going to be, and because Peter mentioned the quantity of data that's going into the process as well. So there will be data hosting equipment or hardware and the location that needs to be considered. So all this to ensure that the value chain or the supply chain involved by the AI will reflect the profit sharing in the future. So I think this would be the key elements a company needs, or a group needs, to take into account when they plan for their IP holding structure as well.
No, thank you indeed. I have a question from Stefan, probably for you, Klaus. What strategies should companies employ to safeguard their IP assets while fostering collaboration and innovation within the industry?
Well, it boils down to what contracts and what corporations you've got. So if you are working with other companies, then you would normally set out what the ownership of your IP. So you will normally have quite detailed clauses in your contracts about ownership of IP, and also to some extent that because usually you will have already, so to speak, in your toolbox have got your own IP that you're using. So you need to obviously make sure that you can continue to use that. So I think it boils down to looking at the specific cooperation and basically preparing a contract that captures the IP and how who should own it, who should be able to use it going forward as well.
Thank you, Klaus. Peter, probably a question for you from Andrea. How has AI specifically accelerated the drug discovery process in the life science sector?
Well, I would go back to that statistic that I quoted earlier about 15 new compounds that have been discovered by AI being in clinical trials. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm, but we're still quite early in that journey to see how many of these compounds will actually still get through what is a quite arduous and physical long process of real world clinical validation before they make it to market. So quite honestly, the industry is in its infancy. That said, there's a huge amount of enthusiasm. Drug manufacturers like Sanofi and Novartis and others have made big investments and also, signed big contracts with specialist companies that handle the drug discovery with AI side of things. And they're quite interesting commercially because typically they're structured around a not insignificant upfront fee to do the development, but a very sizable royalty share if the drug reaches market. So both sides are betting on these drugs making it to market, but we're going to have to wait a few years to see actually how many of them do. And then, as I alluded to earlier, whether the benefit of doing it this way means that actually we'll have a higher success rate than today's, I think, 7% of drugs that start clinical testing of some form, which already excludes a lot of potential compounds that never even make it that far. Only 7% that get to that point, that waypoint, actually make it onto the market. So once again, early days, but still calls for optimism.
Peter, in your experience, I mean, are you finding that sort of the traditional life science companies, pharma companies, are sort of saying, okay, look, percentage of our R&D budget is now going to be allocated towards AI, and you see a gradual increase in that percentage of the total budget being allocated towards AI?
I think we're at the stage where it's still a lot of the bigger manufacturers who maybe have got a slightly higher capacity tolerance for risk are making some lighthouse deals around this. But I think what's interesting, actually, pharma more generally as an industry, is that like many other industries, adopting technologies such as ChatGPT, so if you like consumer AI, as a way of upgrading its overall business processes. So I think, again, a lot of this comes down to the way the technology is applied in different domains, the skills component to it. And I believe that actually pharma has been more vocal than some other industries about actually wanting to use AI to improve, for example, its omni-channel strategies and its other internal processes. So I think that will probably create working cultures that are more ready to reap the benefits of AI when it indeed shows that it's delivering on the fundamental scientific benefits we all hope. So I think it's at the pilot stage, but I think there's some significant pilots out there. So it definitely can't be ignored or seen as a flash in the pan.
Yeah, I think this question is probably geared towards you as well, Peter. I mean, when you mentioned about you're involved with the University of Birmingham, this is from Anshu Bansal. Healthcare innovations have in the past come from startups, spin-outs, academia as well. Having recently seen an academic position paper that talks about how corporate research powerhouses, the like of Google, OpenAI, etc., how much can small startups move the needle in AI-based healthcare innovation, given they don't have access to similar resources?
I think it's a very valid question, and ones that you look at the salaries that are being paid by some of these big conglomerates, and it's very, very daunting. I think that there's an environment where of course, it's about the technology, but the technology is only one part of a solution. As an engineer, I'm much more motivated by solving a problem effectively with, if possible, the most simple form of underlying technology than necessarily trying to find a home for the latest, shiniest bit of technology that may be out there. And so what does that mean in terms of the question? I think there are and there will be opportunities for people to innovate and be the leaders in their field by not necessarily coming up with the new technology, but actually coming up with the most effective overall product solution for solving a particular problem. And that requires deep understanding of the problem space, either the therapeutic area or the clinical workflow, or the particular challenges of prescribing a drug, which a tech entity, a machine learning entity on their own, regardless of how many scientific advisors, cannot necessarily be the best at. So I think there is still space for people who innovate, not in terms of the technology, but actually in terms of how the technology is applied to really make a significant move in this area.
Thank you, Peter. I think we're running close to time. Maybe able to just squeeze in one more question, which is from Lara. Probably geared towards you, Klaus. What are some of the key regulatory challenges that life science companies face when adopting AI technologies? And how can organizations ensure compliance with evolving guidelines while leveraging AI for innovation?
I think fundamentally it's by viewing AI as a tool that assists in the process. I think you hear, I mean, you hear stories about, or not just stories, but I mean, you hear evidence about how development time of drugs is fundamentally reduced from, let's say, 4 or 5 years to around a year, for instance. And I think the challenge is to view it as a tool that you can't use as a cushion, because you still got to sign off and you still need to present your medical device or your drug product in a proper way to the authorities. So I think it's to view it as a tool that can assist you in the process, but not necessarily view it as a cushion that will do it for you.
Okay, no, thank you very much indeed, Klaus. I think we're running close to the time bit for this webinar. I mean, time flies when you're enjoying yourself, right? And I hope you've all sort of, the audience enjoyed the various views that have come from Peter, Klaus, and Chris on different aspects of the impact that AI is actually having in life sciences. As I mentioned earlier on, the recording will be sort of shared with you in the next few days. If there are any specific questions that you actually have and you'd like to actually discuss more, please feel free to contact us through our websites. I hopefully look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you for joining, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.